Before he died, I asked Gary Serkin to help me get to the bottom of this once and for all. It was confirmed by an old interview with Johnny Jones. With all the mythology around Hendrix, I've seen misinformation from all angles. This is the true story. But sadly, the developers don't seem to care.
So much for history. It's gone.
Jimi Hendrix was a Nashville guitar player. In North Nashville, there was Jefferson Street, home to an underground R&B scene in the early 1960s. Granted, we didn't have Stax Records, and we didn't have Motown. Instead, we got Jimi Hendrix. I recently saw an interview with a Nashville session player who was continuing to cite local mythology and disproven rumors. I'm certainly not talking about Tom Bukovac, who's absolutely great, and not Guthrie Trapp, who I've probably known at least 15 years, maybe longer, and is also great. I don't know Tom at all, but I do know he's got enough of a rock historian's mind for these things that I certainly don't think he'd say much about anything unless he'd truly studied it. I've studied Jimmy's history, in particular, pretty extensively over a lifespan, which leads to Gary Serkin. Great, who was Gary Serkin? You've probably never heard of him. Gary was an old friend of Billy Cox's and the only person I ever met in my whole life who both knew more about Jimi Hendrix and frankly cared more. I was impressed that in this great big world, I found someone who was more nutso about Hendrix than me. We met in 2001 in May outside of Rock Block Guitars on Elliston Place. Gary fumed, "What's your story?" and then proceeded to rant for a solid 45 minutes. It was a pretty great thing. Anybody who ever met Gary would know what I'm talking about. He'd flown up to Seattle to be part of the house band at an event put on by the estate in Seattle. That was the night that the Band of Gypsys reunited. Without getting into how heated and volatile views on the estate truly are, the non-emotional straight facts of the matter are simply that the estate used to put on a Jimi Hendrix electric guitar competition in Seattle in the 1990s. I did it a couple times as a kid. The second time I did it, I won the West Coast Regional and was slated to go to the Nationals, but chose to give my spot up to the second runner-up because the Nationals happened to be the same weekend that I wanted to go track down Vince Gill, who told me to move here. As a concession and sympathy gesture for giving up my spot, I was invited to the Band of Gypsys reunion, where a bunch of famous guitar players were supposed to show up. And when Buddy and Billy kicked into it, man, it sounded exactly like the Band of Gypsys. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. You know the beginning of that record? We'd like to welcome back some old friends with a brand new name, a Band of Gypsys. Eric Gales was there to cover all the Hendrix parts. That first conversation I had with Gary 2 years later on confirmed all of my bizarre impressions of Slash that evening, who I'd noticed backstage with a bottle of Jack Daniels. By the time he got on stage, Slash was pretty loosened up, and I distinctly remember him trying to play I Don't Live Today. He tried, but couldn't get his Les Paul to feed back in front of the Marshalls. And although I didn't care one iota about the Seattle bands at the time, and I can't remember for certain, I really feel like Kim Thile from Soundgarden may have also been there, but only in the wings. He definitely didn't play, but I seem to recall him being 10 feet away or something. In any event, it was a big deal in Seattle, and the mythology of him as a hometown hero loomed very large. But let's not say too much about how fame changes people's perception of others who maybe they didn't even have the time of day for before. Gary told me that all night Slash kept shouting in his ear, "Do that Santana thing! Do that Santana thing!" And it still makes me laugh. Gary's gone now, and neither one of us ever knew what that Santana thing was. So Slash, what was that Santana thing? I want to know. Now, if you don't believe everything I say next just because Gary Serkin told me and you're wondering, okay, who was Gary? The vast bulk of this was confirmed by Johnny Jones, the blues guitar player, in a video interview conducted with Gibson. Johnny played with Jimmy over 60 years ago here in this increasingly gentrified town where giants once walked. Rumors have run rampant since, but I like getting to the bottom of the story and cutting out all the garbage. As soon as I moved to town, I immediately started hearing rumors that Jimmy had lived on Belmont Boulevard. Later on, when I asked Gary, he said he'd also heard Division Street. That didn't happen either, but the developers of the W Hotel implied so anyhow, with the Hendrix mural on the side of the building. In fact, I saw an Instagram photo of Tyler from Music Is Win standing in front of it. But as Gary told me all those years ago, neither are true. Johnny Jones held a gig at the Club Baron on Jefferson Street. A few blocks down, Jimmy lived rent-free above Joyce's House of Glamour in a room with Billy Cox. And here's a picture of Jimmy, Larry Lee, and Joyce in 1962. The building was located where the park is now, under the freeway at exit 207, the Jefferson Street exit off of I-40. Evidently, Jefferson Street was never the same after the interstate went in. It's a famous Nashville story and well documented that one night, Jimmy decided to show up at the Club Baron for a guitar duel with Johnny Jones. Larry Lee carried the guitar amp in through the doors for Jimmy, and that's documented in the interview straight from Johnny's mouth to your ears. Larry Lee was of course another old friend of Jimmy's who he reached out to later on. Here's the letter Jimmy wrote to Larry a little while before the Woodstock gig. Although the old Club Baron building was damaged in the 2020 tornado, the building still stands and is now the Elks Lodge on Jefferson Street. It's the last standing structure from Jimmy's years here in Nashville. Now, in this particular evening, perhaps for the last time ever in his life, Jimi Hendrix was not loud enough. Consider that the next time they tell you it must be a silent stage. Excuse me while I load in my super lead. How big of a wall of 4x12 cabinets would you like? That reminds me of my friend Mike Volz, who was working for Gibson and ordered to go downtown before AC/DC played at the Bridgestone Arena many years ago, well over a decade ago. Mike told me, all those amplifiers, they're live. Talk about some real-life heavy-duty rock and roll, Spinal Tap, heavy-duty rock and roll. Brings out the duty in my soul. But back to the main story. Johnny was playing through a Fender Dual Showman with two 15-inch JBL speakers. That's 100 watts. Now there's some mixed information on exactly which amp Jimmy brought, but in either event, Jimmy was underpowered. Johnny Jones said that Jimmy had a, quote, Fender reverb with 410s, and I think the only thing that would have fit that bill was the super reverb. The concert had 410s, but there was no reverb in it, although the concert had that beautiful harmonic tremolo. However, Gary said that Larry Lee told him personally that Jimmy's amp was a Silvertone Twin 12. Larry told Jimmy not to use it for the Guitar Showdown, but Jimmy wouldn't listen. That's rock and roll. I tend to think that the Twin 12 is far more likely the complete truth of the amplifier, specifically based on these next few details. Billy and Jimmy's regular gig was at the Club Del Morocco at 2417 Jefferson Street. It was a dinner club with a 200 patron capacity, owned by Theodore Acklin, known as Uncle Teddy. Speaking of Teddy and the reason that the name Teddy makes me happy, I primarily only use YouTube now just to watch Uncle Doug's tube amp repair instruction and Teddy the Golden Retriever. But this is not an electronics or a Golden Retriever channel, so back to regularly scheduled programming. I just thought you should know, the name Teddy makes me happy. And evidently it made Jimi Hendrix happy too, because Billy and Jimmy's band was called the King Casuals, with a K, and they were given a 1-year resident band contract at the Del Morocco. Look at this photograph. That's a Silvertone Twin 12 right there behind Jimmy. Then consider two books, Starting at Zero, His Own Story, and Hendrix on Hendrix. Jimmy says, we worked for a setup called W&W. They paid us so little that we decided the two W's stood for wicked and wrong. Then we got in with a club owner who seemed to like us a lot. He bought us some new gear. I had a Silvertone amp, and the others got Fender Bandmasters. Whether it was a Twin 12 or by some strange turn of events happened to be a super reverb for one night only, Jimmy was underpowered. When it comes to the Silvertone, I'm not sure I believe the marketing hype of 60 watts at all. In fact, Mercury Magnetics published an interview with Los Angeles guitar and amp tech Andy Brower, and they suggest in the interview that it's a 50-watt amplifier, but not a very loud 50 watts. Mercury Magnetics says, quote, funny, it doesn't sound like a modern 50-watt amp, more like 20 watts. And then he goes on to talk about the plate resistors, which I found interesting as an old tube amp guy, but to keep this simple, so Fenders allow more current to flow, they asked? Brower responds, yes, this results in a lot more headroom, a lot more clarity, and more overall punch. In terms of load lines, which I've been studying, I understand that the higher plate resistors on the Silvertone would have given it more voltage swing but less current to back it up. Elsewhere in the interview, Brower says, quote, those amps are not extremely loud, and says that the speakers in the one on his bench at the time of the interview were Jensen C12Qs, a ceramic speaker with a capacity of 20 to 25 watts. He says, quote, their small magnetics tend to break up faster and be a little honkier. As for super reverbs, those were shipped with Oxford, Jensen, or CTS speakers. Meanwhile, the Dual Showman had two big 15-inch JBL D140s. And if this was a lesson on guitar tone, amplification, and gear, all of which is frankly not going so well on this channel in the age of Tonex, Kemper, and YouTube influencers, we delve very deep, much deeper, and considerably deeper, I would love to, in the details of what made Jimmy underpowered that night. Maybe it could help you not be underpowered. But I feel like a relic because so much of what I've given a lifetime to learning feels like it's been replaced by a digital footprint that moves way too fast on the short-term whims of an algorithm. But in brief, when it comes to how loud an amp is or is not, you got to consider output power, and there's also speaker sensitivity. That means how efficient the speaker is. JBLs were pretty efficient speakers. By comparison, Oxfords and Jensens certainly were not. So when you pour 100 watts into a pair of 15-inch JBLs with an ES335 guitar with humbuckers, you're going to vastly overpower the guy with a lower wattage amp driving much less efficient speakers. You also have to remember what Andy Brower said earlier. The Twin 12 breaks up faster and has less clean headroom, so the clarity and punch and the attack of the note with the dual showman would cut through the mix much better in a club. It's no wonder that when Jimmy got to England, he never had a quiet amplifier again. He chose a real Doc Brown kind of amplifier, and from what I understand, he also blew up a few, just like Marty McFly. Larry told Gary that Jimmy played well. The crowd just couldn't hear him, so they cheered the loudest for Johnny. Standing outside of the Elks Lodge today, in front of the doors to the old Club Baron, you could almost throw a stone to the underpass where Joyce's House of Glamour and that room upstairs stood. Jimmy must have fallen asleep a lot of nights with the guitar across his chest. Later on, Jimmy moved up the street to 1819 Jefferson Street, which is now the new 1821 development.
So much for history, folks. It's gone. That was it.
But ultimately, Jimmy had to leave Nashville in order to make it. In terms of a career, things just didn't go particularly well for him here. He'd arrived from Fort Campbell, Kentucky after getting out of the Army. He was a paratrooper. Once here, he worked various R&B gigs locally and on the road, but similar to Chet Atkins, in his early years, Jimmy got fired all the time. Also, by the way, Chet really admired Hendrix's playing. Some of the Chet Atkins people I know are not necessarily Hendrix files like myself, but the proof is, in a Guitar Player magazine interview, I think around 1979, Chet says it flat out. He thought Jimmy was great. Jimmy worked a few sessions at the Stardom King recording studio. It stood at 3557 Dickerson Pike in Madison. I myself spent a lot of time over in Madison with Richard Bennett years ago at George Bradfeud's studio, where Richard really liked to work, both on his own records and stuff he was producing. When Fretboard Playground began, the whole idea was to grow this space into an alcove. I wanted it to be a space to share some of the real-world mentorships that I was fortunate to have received, and I'd happily have Richard on the channel, or Vince, or go down to the Union Hall and talk shop with Dave Pomeroy, who graciously set the whole thing up and had me out to play with Billy Cox at a NAMM event Dave was hosting. But without this channel expanding fairly dramatically, this is just the plain truth of the matter. I love those guys way too much to waste their time on a video that gets 79 views. Either way, this video needed to be made once and for all before the channel dies or lives. Because I thought this was too important for the preservation of history itself, I wanted it here preserved for all time. Stardom King is where James Brown recorded several of his biggest hits and where Jimmy did some of his earliest studio work. Of course, being in Nashville, the studio also hosted a steady stream of country sessions. Nashville was the coolest town in the world for a really long time. Stardom had sat vacant since 2000. It was named on Historic Nashville's Nashville 9, a list of endangered properties, with petitions and an organized effort to save the studio. In November of 2021, the property was purchased along with an adjacent parcel of land by the Woodbine Community Organization, with plans to develop an affordable housing community of multifamily units. I'm not sure the present status, if that plan survived or was lost, or if the bulldozers there right now indicate the end of its preservation, but currently the building itself is nowhere to be found when you drive out there.
We've got nice condos, though.
I get it. Times move on. Things change. But this city stands on the shoulders of giants. Whether those giants were Chet Atkins, Duane Allman, who was born at St. Thomas Hospital and went home to the house on Westbrook Avenue, Jimi Hendrix, and many more. The great unknown is, are we going to turn it into any other homogeneous metropolitan city? Or is it still going to be a place where art can coexist alongside business? The Jefferson Street scene was not commercial. Neither was anything Townes Van Zandt ever did. When I moved to town, we still had David Olney, and he actually remembered me after we spoke a few times. But the New York Times only decided that it was appropriate to write an article on him after he died. Nashville always had a really cool artistic underbelly. You just had to know where to go looking for it. In January of 1964, someone suggested that Jimmy should try New York City. Generally being invisible, broke, and undervalued, he went. In less than 2 months, he was touring with the Isley Brothers, but he quit the gig when they made it back to Nashville on a tour stop. and he was here again. Just not for long. The only time he came back was mid-1965 when he performed on the television show Night Train, his first video performance. He was in the band with Buddy and Stacy, filmed at the News Channel 5 television studio, performing the Junior Walker tune Shotgun. Otherwise, for 5 months in 1965, he also worked with Little Richard, and he wrote, "Dearest Dad, I received your letter while I was in Atlanta. I'm playing with Little Richard now. We're going towards the West Coast. We're in Louisiana now, but my address will be in Los Angeles." Ultimately, he left the gig with Little Richard after not getting paid, much like the management agency that tried to stiff me in Los Angeles after a tour with a rather famous artist's daughter abruptly ended. The manager refused to sign an AFM contract and told me to, quote, chill out when I tried. Later on, the same manager wound up on the board of directors of the CMAs. Look, all of my favorite guitar players were undervalued, ignored, and taken for granted. Flower doesn't bloom to be noticed. But the reason that I want this in here is because you need to know that if you're thinking about moving to town, everybody, including all of our heroes, those things happen. In the end, Jimmy was discovered and he was noticed, but it took going back to New York. Linda Keith was dating Keith Richards at the time, and Linda was a friend of Jimmy's. Chas Chandler wanted to get into artist management, and when all was said and done, Linda told Chas to go down to the Cafe Wah and check out this guitar player. And of course, the rest is history. Jimmy arrived in London and turned the scene upside down, pretty much overnight. But even after the bomb went off, which is what Jeff Beck compared it to, Jimmy continued to remember his time in Nashville. In 1967, he told the Los Angeles Free Press, "You really had to play, because those people were really hard to please. That's where I learned to play, really, in Nashville." There's a great moral to the story here. Notice that Jimmy said this is where he learned to play. Not that he bought his way into it with cool gear. I mean, come on. Funky cool guitars, but in the King Casuals days, he was pictured playing that Epiphone Wilshire. Nothing against Epiphone guitars. Father Volts, as I call Mike Volts, did fabulous things for Epiphone. But Fender was not sending Jimi Hendrix guitars. He didn't have the greatest Stratocaster of all time. He didn't even have very much gear. He just was developing his talent, and he worked very hard for it. There's a great quote contained in the book The Stratocaster Chronicles by Tom Wheeler. Jimmy said, quote, "You have to stick with it. Sometimes you're going to be so frustrated you want to give up the guitar. You'll hate the guitar. But all of this is just part of learning, because if you stick with it, you're going to be rewarded." Some days when I'm not sure if this channel or the website are going to survive at all, in the age of instant gratification, on social media, with a much larger market for easy answers, I think about stuff like what Jimmy said. Why are there fewer legacy artists than ever before, in an era with more access than ever before? What has the short-term dopamine hit done to our brains and to our will to stick with something long enough to really get good at it, or even possibly turn pro at it? I don't fear for the next generation of musicians because everyone has to find their own way, but it makes me wonder if there's an audience that remains at all for what I wanted this space to be at the start, or if we've all just grown too distracted. In childhood, as a prepubescent, I used to get so frustrated with the guitar, and I even have the tapes to prove it. On one hand, we've got Jimi Hendrix telling us that we must go through great periods of frustration and stick with it anyhow. On the other hand, we live in a world where a guy on YouTube with over 500,000 followers literally made a video titled, "I hate practicing, so I don't." Leonard Cohen wrote a song that was titled, "One of Us Cannot Be Wrong." Is it "I hate practicing, so I don't," or Jimi Hendrix's example? For that matter, just look up Tommy Emmanuel esteeming the value of working with a metronome even at his level of the game. I can't speak for anyone else, but I've got concerns about it. You can become as good as your ears and hands will let you become. There's only so much time in a day, in a career, in a life. If you want to get good, it's going to take work. I don't buy into this notion that it could never happen again. In fact, I want the next Jimi Hendrix to come along. I'd love to hear another John Coltrane. Why should Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson's legacies not be challenged for their sheer melodicism and harmonic genius? I don't buy into the myth that it has to be over. I'm just concerned that it might be. And if you think I'm an old man shouting at the sky, just look at what Paul Simon said to Paul Zolo in the Song Talk interview, probably close to 30 years ago, maybe more than 30 years ago. The songs can get worse and the market will expand. Paul Simon said that. This doesn't have to die. So work hard and try to make the most out of wherever you're at on the guitar. It can be developed. Incredible things can happen. But it's going to take focus, dedication, determination, hard work, things that you really need to just shut the computer off for, shut the phone off for, and crawl into the process of really dedicating yourself to. And amazing things can happen. So enjoy the journey getting there, and I'll see you on down the line.